So in this video, I'm going to explore the process that I use for creating thumbnails. As you can see here, I've laid out my thumbnails on a grid and I've already completed 4 of them. I would have recorded that process, but unfortunately my recorder wasn't working properly. Either way, you're still pretty much going to see the same thing with another 4. So when I start out, I like to lay them out on a grid because it lets me look at all my compositions at the same time. I don't end up getting entirely stuck on one and trying to finish it completely before moving on to the next. You'll see me jump around a little bit and maybe set one aside for a while and then come back later on. Another thing that you'll notice is that I like to work off of a medium gray instead of a white, because with white, you're already starting at full value and it can be kind of distracting at times. Instead, I find it much easier to think through moving to the darks and to the lights if I'm working from a midtone. When I work on thumbnails, I like to focus just on value, and that means working with black to white. I don't worry about color because introducing that at this stage is just going to add a whole level of complexity and confusion, and I don't want to bother with it. Instead, I'll just focus on looking at how the depths of the scene read. So right now you can see that I'm organizing my thumbnail into 3 major components, and they're all designated with a different shade of gray, and they're all quite distinct. The elements in the scene that are further away are going to be my lightest shade of gray. Then the midground is going to be in the middle, and then the foreground will be darkest. The reason for this is because of something called atmospheric perspective. Sometimes you'll also hear it referred to as aerial perspective. It basically states that things that are further away will be lighter, but it's a little bit more than that. It's actually that your darkest darks in an object, when you perceive them at a distance, will become lighter as that distance increases. So if an object is moving away from you, its darkest darks are just going to keep getting lighter and lighter until it only looks as one solid mass of some light shade, and then eventually it'll just blend into its surrounding area. A lot of beginners who try and paint landscapes will ignore this, or they won't know this particular rule, and that is what causes a lot of issue with the perception of depth in their paintings. So when I start off, I specifically do it with solid and distinct areas in these 3 different shades of gray. If I jumped in with a lot of subtle gradation this early on, then it would be more likely that I'd screw up those levels of depth because they wouldn't be clearly defined for me to work from later on. Having them set out like this is going to make it a lot easier once I start getting into that somewhat finer chiseling of my forms and stuff, because I'll always know this area should be about this dark at its darkest. If you watched my Composition 101 video, you should be noticing here that the composition was kind of framing around a certain area, but that area was completely empty. So what I started doing here was I put in just a shape, an object. I'd eventually turn it into something, but some sort of payoff to have within that frame. Had I left it empty, the viewer would have looked into that space expecting some sort of focal point or something of value to them, but they'd see nothing and they'd be subconsciously disappointed. So this big prominent shape that I ended up dropping in there was actually causing a problem. The viewer's eye would follow those strong edges and go right off the frame. So what I started to do was I started to break up those edges and kind of cloud them over, make them a little weaker so that they'd be less likely to draw the viewer's eye. So at this point, The first thumbnail isn't quite finished yet. It's lacking a narrative or any sort of story to tell, but I found that at this point I was starting to lose the energy and the momentum that I had when I started kind of figuring out some of the shapes. And instead of trying to push and force it out of myself, I decided, you know what, I've got 3 others to do. I'll come back to this one later. Throughout this video, you should see me make a lot of sudden and almost random decisions of just trying out big, bold strokes and completely changing the composition just on a whim. And at this point, you should feel really free to do that. Don't get too attached to anything. So if you see with this character, I just randomly threw what couldn't really even be called necessarily a hairstyle at first, but I figured, you know what, let's try it. It's just a shape, and if I like the shape, I'll figure out some sort of rationalization for it later. But what's important right now is to experiment. Here you can see that I've committed one of the cardinal sins of composition. The two sides of the frame are very similar, they're quite symmetrical, and I kind of lost focus in terms of the big, medium, small distinctions in the shapes that I want to have in my composition. But it happens every now and then, and hopefully you catch yourself afterwards, as I did here. One element that I find especially helpful in composition is something called the super foreground. And I told you about the distinction between background, middle ground, and foreground. But the super foreground is basically a shape that is just barely peeking onto your frame. So if you look at the first thumbnail that I was working on for this video, you've got a little bit of a shape in the bottom left corner, and it's very dark, darker than anything else. You can't quite tell what it is, but you know that there's more to that form off the frame. So it's probably something that's very close. That's why it's so large. And having something like that helps bring the viewer into the scene itself. It's more engaging because that object is now expanding into the world that the viewer is standing in. Here's another mistake that you might have caught. That figure is too dark for his position. His depth in the scene would require his darkest darks to be a little bit lighter than what I've actually used for him. At this point, I'm just noodling. It's clear that I don't really have any idea of what I'm trying to achieve here, so rather than trying and trying and trying over and over and getting nowhere, it's better just to move on and then come back to it later. For this thumbnail, it's definitely taking me a little longer to really get a sense of what I want to do with this. Of course, with all of these thumbnails, I start off with absolutely nothing. I don't have any predetermined ideas, or I haven't thought through any of this at all. So sometimes something will come to me quickly. More often than not, it'll take a while. So don't stress too much, but just keep your eye out for any of those little clues, little ideas that you can really just grab and run with. They'll come out when you least expect them. Just don't be upset if they don't come out immediately right when you want them to. You can see here that I caught myself making yet another mistake. That object that was serving as my secondary focal point was too central in the frame, so I moved it over a little bit to the right, and that made the scene, the composition itself, a little bit more dynamic. If you ask me, an illustration needs two things to be successful. A, it needs to present a setting, a location, or an environment. And B, it needs something to actually unfold within that environment. Even if we're talking about concept art, which is all about defining that environment or that location, I still think that there's a lot of benefit to be had when you actually tell a story in that environment. That story will help you and anyone who is expected to derive their own work from your concepts make decisions based off the story itself. So as we go back into the thumbnails that I had left, what I want to focus on now is establishing that narrative, putting in a little bit of story, some character interaction, just something that's actually happening. If you ever find yourself struggling when you're trying to capture the silhouette of a particular object, for example, me struggling with this goddamn horse, then don't feel afraid to go and look for reference. It really helps even to capture the silhouette, because once you've got that shape in there, getting the rest of the drawing in later on is going to be much easier. But if you end up having to change the shape and the silhouette, then there's a good chance that you might end up altering the composition or just going off in a direction that you didn't originally intend. And that just about covers it. If you like this video and would like to see more of its kind, then feel free to subscribe to my channel. If you've got any specific questions though, feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll try to respond to them when I can. Thanks for watching.